Drew here, Frisco Tennis String, and in this brief video we're going to discuss the myth of checking tennis string tension after you get it restrung. So let's say you brought your racket in to get it restrung, you want 50 pounds. Is there a way for you to check the tennis string bed to make sure it's 50 pounds? We're going to talk about why that's a bit of a myth and why tennis string bed stiffness or the dynamic tension is really the figure you can monitor, and what's really more important than the reference tension that you have or have will probably have listed after you have the racket restrung on the throat of the racket. So we're going to talk about the reference tension versus the dynamic tension and a little bit of the myth of being able to check the reference tension as you play. We'll talk about that coming up. So when people talk about tennis string tension, they're usually talking about the reference tension or the static tension. It's the most popular term, the ubiquitous term, where if I bring my racket to someone and say I want it strung at 50 pounds, I'll usually put the reference tension or the static tension on the side so I know it for reference, and they'll string every main and every cross if I want the cross to string the same at 50 pounds. So that is the reference tension for us to use going forward. However, I would like to talk about the string bed stiffness because it's the string bed that really sets the tempo. So although that's the reference tension, the string bed stiffness or the dynamic tension of what the string bed actually feels like is actually more important, and that's actually what we are able to monitor a bit better than the actual static tension. The static tension is very difficult to monitor in like 50 pounds terms because there's so many variables, and let's just talk about one real quick. So I have two rackets here. One is obviously a smaller head size than the other. Let's say I use the same stringing machine, same stringer, same string, same string tension, and I string them exactly the same. Well, this racket will have a very different string bed stiffness or dynamic tension than this one. Just looking at the head size, I can string them exactly the same. They will have different string bed stiffnesses just because the head size is so much larger. The stringing pattern is different. So the string bed stiffness will be different. So that's just one example of why if I say I want it strung at 50 pounds, there's no way I can make sure this equals this, even though it's strung at 50. So that's why the string bed stiffness or the dynamic tension is what we need to be focused on. Another example, let's say we want to string this racket at 50 pounds with, and we have two of the same racket. One we string with Velocity, which is a softer multi-filament, and the other one with RPM Blast, which is a poly. So 50 pounds. So should the rackets feel the same if we string them both at 50 pounds? And the answer is no, because one will obviously be more elastic and the string bed will be softer than the more inelastic string. So again, that's why we can't measure the 50 pounds to make sure it stays at 50, because it's the woven mains and crosses, the string bed stiffness, that we need to be measuring. And so that's what we need to be focused on, the dynamic tension or the string bed stiffness. So with all that being said, there is a way for us to measure the string bed stiffness or dynamic tension. So we have our reference tension or a static tension that we all know. That's what we tell people what we string our rackets at. But how do we measure the string bed stiffness? Because it is important, the tension of the racket, to make sure it is strung correctly and something that you prefer, or maybe you find out you don't like the setup and you want to know what the string bed stiffness is. So there's a few methods you can do. I've seen people do apps where you can listen to the sound of the string bed to get the frequency. I've seen different tools where you can measure what the strings are using like a spring to feel what the pressure is. I would just recommend that you use something right after the racket is restrung, so you can use that as a reference. The problem is there's so many variables with how a racket feels after it's been restrung. It's really best fresh off the stringing machine to see what it's measuring at. That way you can compare it to whether you like it or not to what it was, and then over time see how that's decreasing. Stringing professionally, I use the Beers RT300. I believe it's what they use on tour. It's an electronic device that sends micro vibrations across the string bed to see, I think it's like kilopounds to move a centimeter, I think is officially, but usually we just say what's the DT or dynamic tension of a string bed. Even using this, it really only works best when you fresh off the stringing machine, see what the DT or dynamic tension is. That way you can measure it going forward, what the string bed decreases over time, or maybe it's a little bit higher than you'd like. So if you string it at 50 pounds, it has a little chart that can show you where 50 pounds should be on the DT reading. But even then, it's best to know right off the stringing machine, because if you're using a natural gut string or a thin gauge string or a thick gauge string or all a stiff poly, you really need to know what it's measuring at fresh off the stringing machine to see where the string bed goes over time using a Beers ERT. And I know it's a little bit expensive, so if you don't string for many people, or you maybe just string on your own, maybe one of those other items you would find would work well. It's been hit and miss with me over the years a bit, so that's why I've gone and paid more for this, but maybe that would work fine. Just I would always recommend fresh off the stringing machine, seeing what it measures. That way you can always see where it goes after playing. I hope you found this video useful. It's, I think, a common myth out there. I know I was guilty of it, thinking if I want my racket restring at a tension, I can just test, does it measure at 50 pounds, but it's actually incorrect. It's the string bed stiffness or dynamic tension that is really more important, and we can't really just say that's measuring at 50 because there's so many variables when you have your reference tension or static tension entered that it's really what does the racket feel like. You can even have rackets with the same head size, but even the pattern is different. The way the grommets go is different. So the string bed stiffness or feel is going to be very different. So the dynamic tension is really what we need to focus on. And that is something we can track and measure. So that's just a common myth. I know I was guilty of it, and I hope you found this video useful.